You've heard people say often in the past that we face an impending disaster. Well, they were right. In general, but that's only useful if you can be specific as to what disaster and when and where. Historian Niall Ferguson's most recent book looks at the history of disasters that have hit the human race and asks for questions about what can we learn about them that would actually be useful for the future. Sounds like an important thing to discuss, so let's dive in. This video isn't so much a book review as it is a discussion of the issues raised by the book. But let me just say up front that Niall Ferguson, no relation to the epidemiologist Niall Ferguson, Niall Ferguson is an insightful historian whose work is always highly relevant to our current issues and dilemmas. His book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, is one that I unreservedly recommend for the viewers of this channel. Now, inevitably, we can only scratch the surface of the issues that it talks about in a video like this, so feel free to get the book. So let's talk catastrophes. You could argue that the label catastrophic has been devalued by overuse in recent times. But the human race has seen plenty of genuine catastrophes. They come in the form of wars, plagues, volcanoes and earthquakes, droughts and major floods, terrorist attacks, accidents and economic crashes. Ferguson quotes a financial expert who described COVID-19 as the kind of crisis we've never seen before, and pointedly observed, this illustrated that people who use terms like unprecedented about a crisis are in general merely conveying their ignorance of history. Ferguson talks about how you can put crises into different evocative categories. Some are grey rhinos, a term framed by author Michelle Walker as dangerous, obvious and highly probable. Some are black swans, described by Nassim Taleb as an event that seems to us, on the basis of our limited experience, to be impossible. And then finally, there are dragon kings, defined by geophysicist Didier Sornet as an event so extreme that it lies outside a power law distribution, associated with the occurrence of a phase transition catastrophe tipping point. The meteor strike that wiped out the dinosaurs would be an example of a dragon king event. Some of the catastrophes are thought of as natural, some are very much man-made. But Ferguson points out that the distinction we often make between natural and man-made disasters is actually quite an artificial one. If human societies decide to site a major city along a known geological fault line, well, sure, when the earthquake comes, that's a natural phenomenon, but the number of people affected is also rather dictated by that element of knowing human choice. Ferguson puts it like this. Here is one of the stranger quirks of the politics of disaster. Humans nearly always return to the scene, no matter how vast the disaster. Naples grew to be one of modern Italy's largest cities, despite another large eruption in 1631, enough to kill between 3,000 and 6,000 people. Today, Naples is the third largest metropolitan area in Italy, with a population of 3.7 million. There is an evacuation plan for the eventuality of another eruption of Vesuvius, but it would be of little use if something on the scale of 1780 BC or AD 79 were to occur. He went on to point out that Asia, particularly Indonesia, is where volcanoes kill the most humans. In the past 10,000 years, it has been estimated Indonesia has accounted for only 17% of all volcanic eruptions, but 33% of the eruptions known to have produced human fatalities. A more risk-averse species simply would not have settled there. So our overall societal propensity to disregard known risks of catastrophic harm, but with tiny likelihoods, that is a constant factor in the impact of disasters through history. Hopefully, none of us get to see any of the truly huge scale, like end-of-the-world events. That large meteor hitting the world did for the dinosaurs, and it would most likely do for us as well. The Vredefort crater in South Africa was created around 2 billion years ago, has an estimated diameter of 190 miles, which would have been one hell of a bang. Sudbury Basin in Ontario was 1.8 billion years ago, has a diameter of 81 miles. The Acraman crater in South Australia was 580 million years ago and is about 12 miles across. And finally, the Chicxulub crater on the Yucatan Peninsula is more than 66 million years old. Yes, that's when the dinosaurs went, and is 93 miles across. Now, it doesn't have to come from the outside. The volcanic super eruption at the Yellowstone 630,000 years ago covered half of the continental United States with ash. The eruption of what is now Lake Toba in Sumatra 75,000 years ago caused land temperatures to drop globally between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius because of all the ash and soot that was injected into the stratosphere. That may have brought the human race as it then was to the brink of extinction, reducing its total population to as few as 4,000 individuals. And as for challenge of eruptions, even at the significantly smaller scale, they have their biggest impact indirectly by affecting the climate. Following the eruption of Huaynaputina in far-off Peru in 1600, Switzerland, Estonia, Latvia and Sweden all experienced extremely low temperatures the following winter, while in Russia more than 500,000 people are thought to have starved to death in famine. That was dwarfed by Laki in Iceland in 1783-84, which filled the stratosphere with around 110 million tonnes of sulfates. In its aftermath, Benjamin Franklin commented on the constant fog over Europe and parts of North America, and parish records in England and France showed significant excess mortality from respiratory conditions. Also, there was an extremely severe winter. The Mississippi froze in New Orleans, for instance. If you don't need to live next to a volcano, you also don't need to live on a fault line. Like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes follow a power law, which makes it difficult to anticipate when and how strong they will be. The deadliest earthquake in history was probably the one that hit the Wei River Valley in China in 1556. It was of around 8.0 on the Richter scale, so not the absolutely most powerful one, but it hit a densely populated region, completely destroying 3 cities. The death toll was estimated to be around 800,000. Asian earthquakes generally have tended to be the worst in terms of loss of life, just because the populations living to fault lines have been larger. The biggest Italian earthquake hit Messina in 1908. 90% of the city's buildings were destroyed, partly by the quake, partly by the 40-foot tsunami that followed it, and partly by fire. 60 to 80,000 people died. Messina was known as the City of the Dead for a while. Today it has around 230,000 people living there, because people nearly always go back. So traditionally, earthquakes are only as deadly as there are centres of population and badly constructed buildings near to the epicentre. But times move on, and we found new ways to add to the excitement by building nuclear power stations in some of the areas at risk. In 2007, Katsuhiko Ishibashi was the person who took the role of Cassandra. He was a seismologist. He wrote an article arguing that a significant earthquake could take out reactors' external power, and a tsunami could then overtop the seawalls, flood the emergency diesel generators, disable cooling of the reactors, and lead to meltdowns. Like most Cassandras, his warnings were dismissed, particularly by TEPCO, the company in charge of the Fukushima nuclear plant. How they must have laughed at their mistake when exactly those circumstances took place. Tsunamis come with earthquakes, but of course catastrophic flooding events have happened in the absence of earthquakes. The Chinese Communist Party under Chairman Mao got heavily into dam building, but the quality of those dams wasn't always of the most robust. In August 1975, Typhoon Nina dumped a year's worth of rain in 12 hours, caused the collapse of the Banqiao Dam, becoming one of the worst disasters in the history of the People's Republic. The dam failure released the equivalent of 250,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water. It killed tens of thousands of people within matters of hours, and then the ensuing disease and starvation pushed the fatalities to around 200,000 people. Now, you can ask the question there, was the catastrophe the typhoon or the human decisions made in the design and construction of the dam? Logically, such typhoons are going to happen at some point. So if you didn't anticipate it, surely on you. Nothing that's happened in the United States came close to the scale of those catastrophes, for all that they've been bad enough. Hurricanes are one of the areas of focus. Since 1851, a total of 296 North Atlantic hurricanes have made landfall in the US on a seasonal basis. The 1940s is the decade that had the most major hurricanes, with no fewer than 10. The decade that had the fewest, the 1860s, still managed one. Hurricane Katrina was one of the big ones. It was rated by some as a once in 396 years hurricane, by others by a 1 in 40. The spread between those two giving us lots of confidence, obviously. Ivor Van Heerden was the Cassandra, who predicted the damage that would be done, and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was the group that ignored the warnings and failed to complete a credible disaster plan. 1,836 people lost their lives to Katrina. Everyone was a tragedy, of course, and the event was a national trauma. Still, the worst South Asian cyclones killed 2 orders of magnitude more people. A different type of disaster is, very topically, plague. What we've just had has been a major event, perhaps as much because of the consequences of the actions the world has taken as a result of it, but some historical plagues have had much bigger impact. The Black Death was the big one. Between 1/3 and 3/5 of the population of Europe died. In Italy, around 100 towns were wholly depopulated. And in England, the population, which had already declined a bit from the peak of 7 million in 1300, due to the impact of famine and other things, after successive waves of plague, it was down to 2 million. Some people have argued that the survivors of a major plague at least then benefit because the reduced number of workers makes them more valuable and has the effect of raising wages. Niall Ferguson observes that unfortunately there's more evidence for a period of unrelenting misery for the survivors, since there was a post-plague spike in commodity prices, so wages were not improved by as much as prices went up. For instance, thanks to bad weather and bad harvests, the price of grain went up by 230%, and an unidentified disease was killing sheep, pigs and cattle, which drove up livestock prices. In the medium term, there were benefits for ordinary Englishmen and women, but by then you'd earned your good fortune by sheer endurance. An interesting point in history, which has some echoes today, although I wouldn't overstate the case. The Black Death in England had the effect of strengthening the English state. Because of chronic shortages in food and labour, the Crown instituted wage and price controls in 1351. It raised the per capita tax burden to triple of what it had been, and the 1351 Statute of Labourers compelled every able-bodied man to work. And that eventually proved to be too much, and it provoked the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, although that was mostly aimed at local elites and not at the Crown. That's a dynamic then that has a long history. Measures introduced in a crisis, over time leading to a backlash once the crisis is just a memory. Another precedent you can see is just how people behave in the face of a pandemic. The authorities tried to restrict mobility. The English did it, but probably the best example was the Italian city-states. They tried to prevent people travelling, to pay doles to people who couldn't work, and to impose quarantines. But the wealthy, they were not easily put off fleeing to their rural retreats, taking the pandemic with them. And various groups also actively propagated eccentric theories about the cause and the solutions for the pandemic. For instance, the flagellant orders, men who thought they could ward off the divine retribution of the plague with acts of penance and self-immolation. Nowadays they just, film themselves walking around an empty hospital claiming the whole thing was a hoax. But at least the flagellants in their minds were trying to help. And this is the point Ferguson makes about this. We see here the way a pandemic of infectious disease can easily precipitate a pandemic of extreme behaviour, which in turn further destabilises the social order. For the flagellants were a millenarian movement with a potentially revolutionary agenda that increasingly flouted the authority of the clergy and directed popular wrath against Jewish communities who were accused of willfully spreading the plague or of inviting divine retribution by their repudiation of Christ. Jewish communities were brutally massacred in numerous towns. While they were doing all this, the flagellants were moving around in large groups and so actually helping to spread the plague. There is no crisis so bad that human stupidity can't find a way to make it even worse. Daniel Defoe wrote in 1722 to confirm that the later instances of plague were little better, and he said this: "The apprehensions of the people were likewise strangely increased by the error of the times, in which, I think, the people, from what principle I cannot imagine, were more addicted to prophecies and astrological conjurations, dreams and old wives' tales than ever they were before or since. Whether this unhappy temper was originally raised by the follies of some people who got money by it, that is to say, by printing predictions and prognostications, I know not, but certain it is books frighted them terribly. Now we have Facebook and YouTube to perform the same functions." And the fun fact is that we gradually, step by step, improved our understanding of diseases, began to move medicine out of the age of barbarity and to some extent into the age of evidence-driven treatments. So we also set ourselves back by improving our transport, making our human networks faster and more far-reaching. So eventually we created a global common market in microbes. And as we internationalised, some populations became exposed to diseases that their carriers were immune to, but which devastated their new targets. Indigenous people in the Americas, for instance, and of course Europeans to the diseases of the tropics. So diseases like cholera, which was a disease endemic to the Ganges River in India, was exported to the world by the British East India Company, resulting in no fewer than 6 cholera pandemics in the 1800s. Some people get very moralistic about the history of how diseases spread, but it was inevitable that in some way or another the world was going to become more globally connected. Sooner or later those exposures were going to happen, whether it was conquistadors or diplomats or just curious travellers who spread them. We now see many fewer major plagues at disaster proportions a day. Many think that's predominantly to do with the advances of medical science. And there's some of that, but less than you would think. The real progress came, often unknowingly, as populations benefited from improved housing, proper sewage, waste disposal systems, ventilation for dwellings and the use of disinfectants and insecticides in buildings. All of those massively improved public health because they reduced the exposure of populations to pathogens. Even when it was completely wrong, it was sometimes right. Swamps and other standing water were often drained because of mistaken beliefs about miasma, but in so doing handily removed the places where mosquitoes would thrive to spread disease. The other form that catastrophe often takes, of course, is human-made, and that is war. The biggest and most destructive were the 2 world wars. They were predictable and they were predicted. Very much grey rhinos. But in terms of the scale of the destruction, became black swans very quickly to most contemporaries. War killed many more Britons in the 20th century than did pandemics or famines or even killer London fogs. 866,000 killed in the First War alone, including 57,000 who died just on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Over 4 months, up to 1.2 million people, while the Allied forces advanced just 7 miles. The First World War came about because politicians and generals on both sides miscalculated. The Germans believed the Russians were overtaking them militarily, so launched a preemptive strike to stop this from getting worse. The Russians overestimated their own capabilities and ignored the fragility of their own political system. The British feared the consequences if Germany became too dominant, and had arguably failed to do enough to deter German action up to that point. And that actually was the root of Hitler's miscalculation decades later. Britain had said that it would go to war to defend its allies, but Chamberlain had exuded weakness and the country was ill prepared militarily for conflict to come. Hitler presumed that that meant that he could act with impunity. Britain found itself with the job of building its military and its preparedness in the course of the war, not in advance of it. The incompetence of military leadership often made the catastrophe of war far worse. Norman Dixon argued that military life repels the talented, leaving a lot of mediocrity to float to the top. He said that symptoms of military incompetence includes the following: the tendency to waste resources, to cling to outworn traditions without learning from the past, to neglect to use available technology, to reject or ignore information that conflicts with your preconceptions, to underestimate the enemy and to overestimate one's own side, to persist in a given strategy against strong evidence that it's defective, to neglect reconnaissance, to order full frontal assaults often against the enemy's strongest points, and so on and so on. Similar failings can often be found in civilian leadership as well, and this is one of the consistent lessons of history. Leadership often fails in crises, at least in the early stages. Arguably, we should stop being surprised about this when it happens. One of the questions you get left with at the end of all of this is, what disaster is going to come to test us next? Probably not another pandemic. I mean, it's possible. History rarely delivers the crisis you most expect. Of the possible black swans, the things we don't see coming, it could be a dramatic climate event, exacerbated or not by climate change. Mostly such events create less damage to human societies because we've gotten a lot better at mitigating them. Something can always catch you out. A heavily rain-soaked summer in China last year posed a heavy challenge to the Three Gorges Dam. A small additional earthquake or something else could have tipped that balance. A coronal mass ejection from the sun could end up frying a high percentage of the electronics in the world, which would turn quickly into a major catastrophe. But at least you would think we'd be paying attention to the grey rhinos, the things that we can see are definitely coming, but we're arguably paying too little attention to. It could be standard disease rendered more deadly by antibiotic resistance, which I talked about in a previous video. It could be the collapse of important ocean ecosystems with a major impact on food chains. Should we be listening to all those Cassandras that every other time had spoken truth only to be ignored until it was too late? Well, the problem with that is that there's a Cassandra for every possible problem, most of which don't turn into reality. So telling the difference between the ones who will get proved right and the ones who are soon going to be quietly deleting their posts, hoping that nobody noticed, it's impossible to tell. And we can't actively prepare for every possible eventuality. Remember, we thought we were prepared for a pandemic. The UK and the US scored highly on the pandemic preparedness scores, but those plans might as well have been breeding tips for dragon keepers when the pandemic finally arrived. The feasible secret to success in the future probably doesn't so much lie in guessing correctly what's going to be the next thing, but working on systems of governance that are faster, more flexible, more able to focus on reality in the face of confusing messages when the crisis arrives. Niall Ferguson's strongest warning from the book is that in his view, one of the most likely next contenders is a hot war between the West and China. He notes that in the US there is partisan division on just about every single topic of note except for one, an unfavourable view of China. He adds that he's been saying for some time that we are already in a Cold War with China, and many Chinese people have agreed with him. The view in China is that history has turned a corner, the era of Western domination is ending. Contrast that with the growing alarm at that prospect in the West, and particularly add to that the growing suspicion that COVID-19 came from a lab leak that was covered up by China. Now, if such a war did come, it would perhaps come via a very familiar pattern, how we ended up in 2 world wars. Weakness and apparent lack of willpower on the part of the West, meaning that China concludes that it will meet no meaningful resistance to an attempt to reunify with Taiwan. This remains one of Xi Jinping's publicly stated, most cherished ambitions. And if it then proceeds to do so and then finds that actually this was a line too far and then ends up at war. The thing that changed since the previous world wars, of course, is the realisation by all the great powers, actual and aspiring, that in the age of nuclear weapons, it is more or less impossible to win an actual hot war. So the pressures are high to keep it at the level of a Cold War, to win or to lose it at that level. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War partly because it ran out of resources needed to keep up with the West, partly because its citizens, held under by a dysfunctional communist economic system, were apt to be seduced by the lure of Western consumerism. The leftist philosopher Regis Debray bemoaned the fact there is more power in rock music, videos, blue jeans, fast food, news networks and TV satellites than in the entire Red Army. America won the culture war with Russia long before it won the Cold War. Can it do so again against an emerging superpower that has a dynamic economic engine and a growing sophisticated technology for controlling what its citizens see and even think? Can it do so while fighting a culture war against itself? It's a discussion I think we'll be having for a while. For all the people are most actively contemplating catastrophic, end of civilization level events, most catastrophes turn out to be limited and often local. Even the worst ones, more people survive than fall. For the majority, only a tiny number of people are affected. COVID-19 turned out not to be the Black Death or even to be the Spanish influenza. In fact, it may turn out in history to be better remembered as the event that prompted rapid work on breakthrough mRNA technology for the vaccines, that may then go on to become a step change in all sorts of future treatments. We just don't know. When you're living history, you never know how it's going to end up being written up, even if the historical version's even going to be true, come to that. Yes, we've been very good at devising technologies with the power to actually deliver the end of civilization as we know it. Since the late 1950s, we've had the means for collective suicide, or at least catastrophic self-harm. The growing reliance on digital connectivity, the Internet of Things, has increased our fragility, as the recent attack on the colonial pipeline showed. But one of the other lessons on history, and it may turn out to be the lesson of COVID too, is that our response to a catastrophe can be the seed for the next catastrophe. Economist Brian Kaplan put it this way: one particularly scary scenario for the future is that overblown doomsday worries become the rationale for world government, paving the way for an unanticipated global catastrophe, totalitarianism. Those who call for the countries of the world to unite against threats to humanity should consider the possibility that unification itself is the greater threat. For all that, Ferguson ends with this note about what happens after the catastrophe has come and gone. Mostly, for the lucky many, life after the disaster goes on, changed in a few ways, but on the whole remarkably, reassuringly, boringly the same. With astonishing speed, we put our brush with mortality behind us and blithely carry on, forgetful of those who were not so lucky, regardless of the next disaster that lies in wait. Something to bear in mind when every headline writer is trying to scare you about the next big thing.